Hello, and welcome to the Business of Us, where we explore the intersection of business, relationships, and family life. This season, we're focusing on the concept of the three mountains of partnership, purpose, and passion, which are the three big challenges that all couples face throughout their relationship. Whether you're scaling your first mountain or learning to navigate life after the summit, these episodes will give you stories, strategies, and inspiration for the journey. It's my pleasure today to introduce my co-host, the much esteemed Jamie Bourne. Jamie is a licensed therapist who works globally with Entrepreneurs Organization and Young Presidents Organization members, entrepreneurs, and their families, helping them to navigate the unique pressures that come with a high-performance business and a high-stakes relationships. Jamie is a sought-after speaker, retreat leader, and workshop facilitator, and she's incredibly passionate about helping entrepreneurs and their families to navigate the intersection of mental, relational, and family wellness.
Thanks, Cameron. It's also my pleasure to introduce my co-host, Cameron Medill, who founded a multi-million-dollar company that he sold to his team in 2019, which led him to realize his true passion is actually helping people to build strong relationships. He's conducted original research with over 600 entrepreneurs and their spouses to better understand how thriving relationships drive both personal well-being and sustainable success. You can read about his work at www.relationshipscienceguide.com. And today he runs the Happy Couples Project, which is focused on experiential date nights and workshops. Please keep in mind our podcast is for information only and is not therapy. If you need professional support, please visit psychologytoday.com. Great. So our big question today, Cameron, is really looking at how does zooming out and examining your relationship support ongoing intentionality and sustainability of relationships within the entrepreneur community. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your journey and how you developed these three mountains as a concept.
Yeah, Jamie, excited to talk about it. This framework, which is based on some great work by a woman named Jennifer Patriglieri, who's an academic and a coach at a high-end business school, came from really digging into couples and looking at, if you zoom way out, of course, all of our stories are unique, but are there common points in the relationship that are kind of like moments of truth? And what she found in her research was that there were three primary moments of truth where couples either, at the worst, they split apart, or they sort of muddled through, but they created long-lasting resentment and distance in the relationship at the cost of figuring out how to basically keep things working. Or they actually took this moment of real challenge and they use it as an opportunity to reinvent not just themselves, but the relationship as a whole and go deeper and have a greater level of connection and intimacy and, love for each other. So I think where this really came out in my life was back in 2018. And I was at such a low point in my career, which like so often in life, it had come on the heels of a real high. 2017 had been this year where it felt like kind of everything was working in my life. The business was thriving. I'd won a few really prestigious awards, which probably caused my head to expand and too much. I remember saying out loud once, which is for sure the kiss of death, that I was like, I feel like I have the Midas touch. Like everything I did just seemed to work. Business, personal, nonprofit volunteer, community. And so 2018, it kind of all came crashing down. And it was just this incredibly low point where really like probably hadn't happened in close to a decade. My business just started intruding on my life in such a difficult level. We had our two biggest clients had both, without any warning, postponed both their projects by at least 6 months. I had just hired a friend on the assumption of that revenue, and I was fairly panicked that I was going to have to let her go. We had an employee who just had a lot of challenges they were dealing with, and they had actually gotten access to confidential records. And so stories started getting floated throughout the company, which were not completely untrue. They were based on seeing a document, but they completely lacked the context and the work that had been done all around it. And so it was like everything felt like it was kind of falling apart. And I just found in my relationship with my wife, Anna, I couldn't be present. I was just either kind of like emotionally dead or I was just spinning. I was thinking about, what about this? What about that? This might go wrong. I need to do this thing. And what kind of shook me out of it was, among other things, a conversation with a friend who kind of gave me this way zoomed out perspective. And she basically said that, in every relationship, you're going to go through a certain set of challenges. Everything meaningful in life is also going to be associated with some degree of challenge and struggle. And when I was able to kind of zoom way out and understand that this wasn't, while it was painful, it wasn't something that was unique to me and it was actually part of the journey. It was really powerful and it actually kind of enabled me to reconnect with Anna. And I think it was on many levels the most powerful year for us as a couple because I was able to start to open up about some of the pains and the struggles that I was having. And she was able to be there for me rather than me kind of putting this wall up because I felt like a failure. That's my passion around having a bit of the long view in our relationships and not getting overwhelmed. My son today is his first day of kindergarten, and so it's sort of the similar thing. For him it is so important and it's so new, right? But there were hundreds of other kids there who it was their first day, and you and I, Jamie, got through our first day of kindergarten, right? And so I've been trying to do the same thing of helping him to see that while this is a really big deal, it's not unique, it's not the only moment, and he will get through it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're in uncharted territory, right? I mean, I think that it helps to somewhat give some guardrails around uncharted territory, unless you know that you're not alone and give you some point of reference for where you're at. And even though everybody's individual situation is unique, having that sort of framework to help conceptualize it, I think can help people to sort of orient in the moment to where they're at and then start to make some decisions on how they want to move forward. So they don't end up right in that space of like, we're done. We got caught off guard and now it's over.
That's what I loved about it so much was I'd seen things like this for businesses, right? Businesses have well-defined life cycles. Our children, there's all this stuff out there about, child development trajectories, but I just got intrigued by that relationship idea. So, Jamie, I'd love to hear, how do you interpret these three mountains in your own life and which mountain do you think you're on?
I think that we are still in some ways in the how, that we are continually trying to it feels like as soon as the kids hit a certain threshold and we adjust to that space, that then they enter into this new space and it sort of puts everything else back into motion again. And so I think for Seth and I, we're really solidly in that how mountain currently. Actually, and I'd love to get your take on this, but it feels like we move into that what space and then we move into the who space, and then we go back into the how space. And so there's this intricate dance, I think, that we go through based on what goals we have outlined and then what milestones our kids reach, right? And so we're constantly evolving between those spaces and having to check back in on these things. It isn't as linear, I think, sometimes as we'd like to think it is.
Yeah, I completely agree. The map is not the terrain. Any framework like this won't be something that we all follow exactly in sequence, but it's helpful to kind of know. All right, so let me quick share with you all a little bit more about these three mountains. So, mountain one, which I think is all about partnership, like truly becoming partners, or if you think about it, it's about the how. How do we make things work? And so it's all about kind of the grit and daily work that it takes to stay connected as a couple and be effective at lifing, as I know people like to say sometimes, when there's just a whole lot of challenge and complexity on your plates. Mountain two is all about purpose or the what. And so this is, really kind of the proverbial midlife crisis. Like, how do you recalibrate after you achieve goals? I think that's certainly where I feel most myself right now after stepping down as CEO of my company at the end of 2023. It's been really fun and great in a lot of ways, but it's been very confusing and alienating in others. I had so many years of just feeling very secure in who I was and, kind of why I woke up in the morning and where I went and what I did. And it's just so wide open. And so how do you figure out what's next? How do you define what is enough? And how do you make sure that in essence, particularly when one partner achieves a goal, then it destabilizes whatever that balance or equilibrium is in the relationship. And that certainly could be for the better, but it can also be for the worse. And so how do you intentionally navigate that? And then mountain three is all about, I think, kind of building that passion that's going to take you through the last chapters of life or thinking about who. So the big question is, who are you now, often after the kids have left home, or careers, you're kind of on the downslope of your career, but it's no longer the thing on center stage. And so what's your identity and purpose as life starts to slow down to make sure that, again, you stay connected as a couple and you're growing together rather than growing apart?
I'd love to kind of dig into each of these just a little bit more so that we can give everybody a good grasp of what's to come this season and really, really kind of get into it. So, what we're going to do is to talk about each of these over a series of 3 episodes this coming year. And so, the first 3 episodes are going to be really, really focused in on the how. And so, tell me more about what making it work when it's hard looks like.
I think we've all been there. There's two moments I really think of. One is certainly like it's classic. I think every parent can relate to this. But, we had a stretch early on after our son was born, maybe about a year afterwards. And I was probably doing more of the childcare, maybe 60%, a little bit more. And I started to get really resentful of Anna. And what it boiled down to was everyone who's had a kid knows this, right? And it could be an aging parent or other things. The amount of stuff that Anna and I had to manage before we had a kid, it wasn't that much. It wasn't that hard. We could kind of just focus on the relationship. And it was just like, my God, we had like 10 times as many things to work on. And, sleep schedules were wonky and date nights were hard to get. I think we had kind of both been able to have our cake and eat it up until then. And she just was doing awesome in her career. She was crushing it, like amazing work on her part and well-deserved and decade and a half of, work that built up to it. But I was really kind of on the slow exit from my company. And so it only made sense that I would be doing more of this. But I just don't think I was doing a good job of communicating where I was at or what my needs were, or us being really kind of aware of like, what is this changing dynamic where for probably the first part of our relationship, my career had been going, faster and maybe from an external standpoint, it was more successful. And now it had just totally flipped. I think that just, and then I'm doing, obviously I love the heck out of my son, but, changing poopy diapers and all that, it's fertile ground for, well, many things, gardening, but especially for resentment. Then I think the second one was really where we had a real collision of dreams. And so we lived in one half of a duplex, and it's modest, it's pretty small. And then you throw both of us working from home because of COVID and a new kid because our son was born in May of 2020. We ended up going through this whole kind of complicated journey of, do we want to buy a new house? My sister and her husband lived next door at the time. So we ended up trying to sort of build a win-win where we would remodel half of the duplex. And it just didn't go well. As I've since learned, all remodels go apparently. But, it didn't actually end up feeling good to my sister and her husband. I thought we were building win-win. We spent all this money trying to remodel the house. And ultimately, we could have just moved and probably gotten something nicer for less money. Maybe been in a neighborhood with schools we wanted more. And so I remember we were staying in this rental house that a friend had kindly let us use. But I just didn't love it. I felt really isolated and alone and embittered by kind of how to manage the sheer complexity of careers and life and a remodel. And it just felt like this relentless stream of like the least fun things that happen in life. So again, that was one of those moments where it's like, we had to kind of look at ourselves and say, but how are we going to make this work? Are we going to kind of just build our relationship around resenting each other, around well-intentioned mistakes that we both made, or kind of inevitable challenges, or are we going to figure out some way to move past that and find the good in this situation?
Well, and I think right as you're talking, thinking about some of those common traps that people are facing during this phase, I hear the resentment piece. What are some of the other, well, right, and actually really not even misaligned goals, but even communication challenges, right? So what are some of the other common traps that entrepreneurial couples face in this how mountain?
So, right, yeah, resentment obviously is a classic way to kind of tank your relationship. And then I think, with entrepreneurs and their relationships specifically, I think one of the biggest ones is, what you said, Jamie, of taking the time to really kind of talk through goals. You hear this saying that, often people think, one of our previous podcast guests said that she had hoped her spouse, who was an entrepreneur, would have a phase and then be done, and kind of learned that actually this is more of like an identity or a lifestyle than a thing tied to this specific company or a phase in life. And so I think alignment around those goals of like, what are we doing here? Like, is one party expecting that we're going to work really hard for a decade and then semi-retire, or is another party thinking we'll do this for 5 decades? That's a big deal. I think the other two big traps, there's probably more, but just really figuring out how to support each other emotionally. It's funny because I feel like this is the most basic skill. We learn it with children, we learn it with coworkers, but for the most part, we humans don't want someone else to come in and fix our problem. We want someone to validate, our emotions and our struggles and just be there like a sympathetic friend. And I think for couples, maybe especially because we see each other so much more, it's easier to do this with a friend you see every 2 months than a partner that you see, presumably every day. But I think figuring out if someone's an entrepreneur, how do I support them with all the stresses and challenges and wins of the business without getting caught up in what does this mean for our work-life balance or our financial situation or whatever else. And then vice versa, sometimes I think the entrepreneurial roller coaster can be so overwhelming. And to be honest, I think it can encourage a strong degree of self-centeredness. I enjoyed this, but when you have a company built around you and people generally, every time you talk, they listen and they're eager to please, that's not really a good look when you come home to your partner. And so figuring out how to say, okay, how do I set that to the side? And then lastly, that thank goodness is getting talked a lot more in society, but we've talked about this as well in past episodes, that just being aware of the mental health state of your partner and holding space for that and supporting whatever work might need to be done. I learned this with Anna, and fortunately it was pretty mild for her, but some people say it's like 80% of mothers are going to get the baby blues, and I think roughly a quarter will get a postpartum depression and or anxiety. So if you have a kid, there's all that logistical stuff, but if your partner's in a state of like mental distress, they're not going to be able to show up for you to their best, and you need to show up in a different way. And then I think in that example I had of, living in that rental house, and I mean, I really was sinking into depression. And so there's no way I could be the best partner for Anna, except for you, Jamie, right? But I always say this, we're not trained therapists, you are. But, in a relationship, it's like just, we're not trying to play therapists, but how do we support our partner and love them and make sure they take the actions they need so that they can maintain their mental well-being? Because it's hard to take on all the details of the how if we're just mentally in a state of suffering.
Yeah. Well, and even as a therapist, right, I'm not immune from any of that. In fact, I think in some ways it's a double-edged sword, right? Where it's like you see, and sometimes you're just in it. And it's hard to navigate, especially when one or both of you is not in a good headspace to be able to start talking about how we start to get through this. You hit that point of just like survival. How are we making it through the day? We're just trying to make it through the day. And it's really hard to incorporate those emotional supports and intentionality in those moments. What are some of the biggest turning points that you see during Mountain One?
Yeah, I'll be quick on this. I think there's three things that stand out to me. The first one is, apropos of the great title of this podcast, which Jamie came up with. It's truly the business of us. I think sometimes it's like, oh gosh, don't take all the magic out of our relationship and turn it into a spreadsheet with action items and all of that. But I think when the how gets really hard, a lot of those skills from business are so important. So there's a wonderful book called Essentialism, which is all about how do you pare things down to the core. I think just getting really clear on what are our roles, what are the things that we're accountable for, and who's going to own them, and when are we going to do them, and what are the standards. There's a lot of good resources out there about that. And it's not why we get into a relationship. It's part of how we get through these moments, because if we're truly ineffective at lifing, as I said, then there's not going to be space or goodwill towards our partner to have those moments of magic. The second one, I think, is how do we create rituals for maximum quality shared time with our partner? Because we all know there's just these phases where there's just very limited time with our partner, and a lot of it has to be spent on, did you pick the child up? Who gets the groceries? How are we going to eat tonight? So whatever that is, I know people who have prioritized a 15-minute shared time together in a hot tub every week. Date nights are obviously classic. I know one couple that does a weekly hike, but whatever it is to create that, another couple I know finds a new coffee shop every week. Lots of stories, but how do you find this thing where it's maximum quality? Because we know the quantity won't be that high. And then lastly, what this whole framework is designed to do is how do we create perspective? There's this idea called Solomon's paradox, which is the idea that Solomon, of course, is this famous biblical super wise person, but it turned out in his personal life he was quite unwise. And so they named it Solomon's paradox, that basically, in general, as humans, the more distance we can get from ourselves, the smarter we are. So that question of, what would you advise a friend in the same situation to do? And people tend to be much smarter and kinder and that versus just beating themselves up. So I think just trying to get that perspective, whether that's talking to friends or asking ourselves what we would advise someone else in the same situation to do, can get us out of what can feel overwhelming. Those are just some of the many techniques. I'm so excited. We've got 3 great episodes, October to December, with guests and stories around this mountain, including one couple that just has an incredible story of where they kind of hit rock bottom and figured out how to grow together through that. But I want to move on to that second mountain. So Jamie, let's talk about mountain number 2, the what. You already teased this, I guess. So you're a therapist. You specialize in entrepreneurial couples and families. So that, of course, doesn't necessarily mean you have it all figured out personally. But I'd love to step back and say, from all the folks you work with and you see and you speak to, what are the patterns you see when people hit these big goals? Like, I've done it. Hurrah. What comes next?
Oftentimes, people are so focused on the goal that once they hit it, there's this sense of anticlimactic or emptiness that occurs. And I think that happens really regular for people and in a really surprising way. because I think there's so much tied to the specific outcome and not necessarily about the sustainability of what you have in place to reach that outcome. And so, I mean, that goes back to sort of burnout. And then once they hit that goal, there's the sense of like, oh, I don't actually feel as fulfilled as I thought that I would now that I've achieved this, or it still isn't quite doing what I thought it was going to do. And so I think that that's a really common theme when people are entering into this space of it is a recalibration because it's like I've achieved this goal. And so what is next? And is this goal actually enough? And so I think within that space, what people also experience is this surprising increase in conflict around how to use newfound time or money or freedom, right? That a lot of effort is put into the goal achievement and then less around what do we do after we hit that goal. And then I think, as you were describing earlier, right, shifting power dynamics. As you're exiting a business and your identity is shifting all at the same time that Anna's is shifting. And so having that happen all at the same time, I think that's the other thing is it's not just one, it's usually all of these things all at the same time, which can be really disorienting for people, right? I think as you're entering that what mountain, the first thing people experience is a little bit of disorientation, which is super normal. And so I think there's also, and this kind of goes back to that sense of emptiness, but this kind of destabilizing gap between what people imagine life is going to feel like, look like, and then the actual lived reality of it. That those two things are not always in alignment.
Can you share about like what do people do then? Yeah, it sounds like it's this big shift. I experienced some of that myself, and there's lots of traps. But what can couples do to navigate one of these big changes, either preparing in advance or after the fact?
It's both, right? And while I think you can do a lot of prep work, I also don't think that you can plan for everything all the time. And so, as much effort as you're putting into the intentionality around what things are going to look like, here's how we're anticipating a shift in roles, a shift in power dynamics, a shift in identity. Sometimes things come out of the blue in a surprising way. And so I think that the biggest piece here is to recognize when you are in a space of disorientation. What do you do when you're disoriented? You don't continue to just walk blindly in the woods, right? If you just take that example of like being in the woods and you're lost and you're disoriented, what do they tell you to do? Sit down and look around and kind of gather your bearings. And so I think that the same applies here, where it isn't just sort of blindly plowing ahead, but really pausing, recognizing that you're in this space of disorientation and figuring out what are the things that you need to reorient to. Is this an identity thing? Is this a priority thing? Is this a, goal alignment thing? What is the actual thing that is causing the disorientation? And then sort of prioritize that and work through it that way.
I mean, this sounds like a great thing. What's dangerous about getting everything you wanted?
But
Isn't that the American dream?
well, it is, but I think that this is why the work that I do is so important because I think that there's this real misconception that people who have external success or hit these, goals and are achieving and are high performers, externally everything looks really good. And so there's almost this added stigma around saying that I'm struggling with this. Like I have attained everything that I've set out to attain and I don't feel good right now. Things are really, really hard because I think the general consensus from people is like, what do you really have to complain about? What a luxury problem that you have. And while they may be problems of luxury, they're still problems and they are still things that deserve our attention. So I think one of the, I mean, just primarily on a very basic level to recognize that achieving some level of success or affluence or goal orientation does not make you immune from being human. In fact, I think that it has some nuanced challenges, specific challenges that not everybody experiences. And those are real. They deserve attention. And so I think some of the potential danger is really the emotional fallout. I think that it is surprising to people because the thought is always that once I hit this thing, everything is going to be great. And it's that idealized version of things that are in your head. And then the reality of it tends to fall short for some reason. Depression, anxiety, not having a purpose, going from being the owner, the CEO, to inbox empty, right? That kind of stuff. What do you tell yourself about what that now means about who you are as a person? Some of the other dangers are relational strain. So I think sometimes we can hide behind the busyness of what we're doing in the business and what goals we're trying, or even with kids, right? Within the family unit, you can hide behind busyness, and once that busyness slows down, you can't mask those things anymore. And so there may be some underlying relational strain that people are experiencing that all of a sudden gets really, really amplified because all of the usual typical things that we're doing to avoid are gone. The other things, right, is just a complete identity collapse of just feeling irrelevant and lost and not knowing what that next step is. And then that translates into our relationships. Because if my identity at its core is shifting, then naturally it impacts all of the important relationships in my life as well. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, but I really like misaligned expectations and goals is just a huge thing. I feel like that is along the way a really common thread. I thought we were done here. Oh, no, this was just the first mountain, my first objective that I wanted to complete. And now, right, part of my personality temperament is continuing to build and create, and I can't just stop doing that, right? And so are there different assumptions over what happens next, and really finding some time to figure out what does it look like to talk through these things? How do we start to get back into alignment? And then once we're in alignment, developing the strategy to move forward.
Anything else you want to say about mountain two before we get to the third mountain?
I don't think so. I'm just really excited for really all of the mountains because I think that it, again, just provides framework that we can draw on as we're navigating it. Like it helps with the reorientation space to be able to say, oh, I'm actually on this mountain right now. And what I'm experiencing is a really common thing. And now that I know the thing that I'm experiencing, I can create a tangible strategy around how to navigate through that thing. So, and we'll be talking more about this specific mountain in January, February, and March this year.
Yeah, we've got some great guests lined up for that. All right, so Jamie, tell us about mountain number 3, because you mentioned mountain number 2 can feel a little overlooked, but I think mountain number 3, even more of like, hey, we're riding off into the sunset. The kids are off at school or whatever they've launched. We're hoping they're not boomeranging. We've got enough money for retirement. Why is this mountain so important for a couple's long-term connection?
I think that one of the things that makes this so overlooked is that I think that we always think we have more time. As you're moving through mountains 1 and 2, and, you know, if especially if there's kids involved, it can seem like the days drag on in some ways. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, we're here. And so there's this, I think, tendency to always think about that as though it's in the future. And then all of a sudden it's there. And so I think that it's easy to overlook that in the sense of like, we'll talk about that later. There's more pressing things that we need to really focus in on right now. And so I think that that is so overlooked and yet so defining in the sense of like, this is what we've been doing the whole time, is getting ourselves to this space. And what does this space now look like? And so now that we're moving out of all of the things that have defined us, our family, our certain other relationships, business, and moving into a calmer season in some ways, really struggling to identify what is our purpose now? How do we fill the time? What do we do when it's really quiet? The silence, I think, is a big piece to this, and learning how to navigate that part.
And so how do couples successfully change, what their purpose is at this phase, what community means to them, what intimacy looks like at this point after career and kids have they're not gone, but they've exited stage left. They're no longer kind of central players.
I think some of it is recognizing and tending to the emotional impact that this has on both partners individually, primarily. That is sort of step one. Do we both know where the other one is sitting? And I think that there is commonly a phase of grief that comes along in this. And I think acknowledging where you're at in the grief process, being able to move through that, then allows you to move into a space where it's like, okay, now what is the opportunity here? So I think sometimes the pull is, again, this is what we've worked hard for. So I should be feeling really good. We should be ready to go. We're going to do all of the things now that we've set out to do now that the other phases of our life are done. and not recognizing sometimes that there's a complexity to people's emotional responses to that. And so allowing space for that complexity to be really present and then being able to say, okay, now that I've honored this, we know where we're at in that grief process, if that's present. Now, how do we continue to move forward in building our new identity as us?
Just before we exit Mountain 3, I know there's so much you could probably share, but if you had to pick like one thing to tell a couple where they're kind of looking at Mountain 3, it's getting closer in the distance, what can they do to navigate that gracefully, versus getting totally blindsided by it?
I think some of it is to really, really plan and identify what are you looking forward to? What are you looking forward to as individuals? And what are you looking forward to as a couple? And making sure that both of those things are really clearly defined. Because then when things are hard, it doesn't mean this sort of Pollyanna-ish, like, oh, we're just going to look at all the things that are great. But what it does do is it provides this sort of balanced and more authentic perspective about where we're at. And so, yes, things might be challenging. I may not have everything figured out yet, but I do know this one piece with absolute certainty that this is something that I personally want to be involved with, engaged in, and this is something that as a couple, we know we enjoy together, that it brings us closer together, builds our connection, and we're going to be doing that together. And so to at least have one thing that you are certain of as you're moving into that space.
I love that. One thing pulling you into the future.
Yeah.
Well, anything else on Mountain 3 you want to share with our audience?
So I'm not sure just how many times this episode that I've said I'm excited for this season, but I really am. Because for me, success isn't just about this, view from the top. It's really more about it's redefining what success means for people, right? And how sustainable are our personal and relational health as we are on this entrepreneurial journey, and bringing our loved ones with us sometimes. So I would invite everybody to just sort of reflect on where you're at right now. Mountain 1, Mountain 2, Mountain 3. We'd love for you to subscribe and share the show with someone that you know who's climbing their own mountain, and leave a review if you enjoyed the episode. And so the next 3 episodes, we're going to be diving deep into the how, making it work when things get hard. Join us next time.